Hello and welcome back to my room. If you've already watched the first video, we're going to be focusing in this video on writing techniques and just sort of building your confidence a little bit when it comes to writing. So one thing I've noticed in doing all the workshops that I do is that sometimes the biggest struggle with writing is just writing, like getting pen to paper in the first place. So we're going to see if we can tackle that first and foremost. So there's a whole bunch of different reasons why people often find getting started so difficult. To tackle that, we're going to start first and foremost by doing a little exercise that I call the house game. Basically, we're all going to write something together at the same time. The purpose of this exercise is really just to grow your confidence in your ability to make decisions. When you're writing a poem or a story or anything, you're in charge of what you're trying to say. It's up to you whether the house is big or small. We're going to look today at different aspects of writing, from description to plot, and we're going to talk about how some of you might excel at one thing and really struggle with another thing. I talked about it a little bit in the last video, but I'm a big believer that everyone has aspects of writing that come a bit more naturally to them, and other aspects which are a little bit more tricky. And we're going to look at them in a bit more detail in this video. So first and foremost, get your writing implement, your pen, your pencil. That's a kazoo. Don't write with a kazoo. Why'd you have a kazoo, MiKo? No questions! I think I've been in this room talking to myself for too long. Now, hopefully you've all got a piece of paper and a pen or whatever it is that you need to write something down with. If you don't, just pause this video quickly and resume when you're ready. If you are watching this as a group and you would like to write this together via show of hands or whoever shouts the loudest, absolutely, you're more than welcome to do that. Sometimes that's a lot of fun. Sometimes people prefer to do it as individuals. It's up to you. So this story begins nice and simply. We have a character that's walking down a street. We will name the character, but we don't need to do that just now. I mean, we have no idea what this character is all about, where they're going, where they're coming from. So don't worry about the name just yet. But your character is walking down a street or a road or a path. That's entirely up to you. And they see a house. Is it on the left-hand side or the right-hand side to them? Just write down left or right. What side of the street or path or road is this house on? So we'll come back to the house in just a second, but first of all, I want to set the scene a little bit further. Next question. Has your character ever been down this street before? Or is this the first time they've ever been there? It's entirely up to you. Write down what you think. Interesting. And what time of day is it? Is it morning? Is it afternoon? Is it the middle of night? Is it tea time? What time of day is it? And the final question before we get back to this house, is there anyone else on the street? Is your character alone? Is there one or two people? Is there a whole crowd of people? Is it like a parade and there's hundreds of people? It's entirely up to you, but make a decision on that and write it down. Now remember, at this point, you don't need to know at all what's happening with the story. You don't need to have made up your mind about anything. Maybe you've no clue what's going on and you've just been answering the questions. That's totally fine. Don't worry about it. As I said, at this point, we've got very little information, but some of you will be thinking about what happens next. Some of you will already be thinking about how the story ends and what's going on. Now, if you're one of those people, that's awesome. If you're not, don't worry about it. Like I said, certain people will find certain aspects of writing a little bit more intuitive than others. If you are someone that's already thinking about what happens next and where the story ultimately goes, then you're probably a more plot focused writer, whether you realize that before now or not. And that is an awesome thing to be, but we need to make sure that the audience comes along with us. Whoever is listening to or reading your writing needs to be imagining and seeing the same things as you. And that's why plot doesn't work on its own. You also need description. So let's get back to this house and actually answer the question I asked before we started asking the questions officially. Big or small? Is the house a big house or is it a small house? If you want to go into more detail, please do. Is it a tiny little cottage? Is it a huge big mansion? Is it somewhere in between? It's up to you. Write it down. Now at this point, a lot of you will have a really clear image in your head of exactly what this house looks like. Some of you might already be able to completely envision the whole street or dirt path you're on or wherever it is, and others will be struggling to imagine it. Again, we'll keep coming back to this, but we're all different, right? We've all got different weird little brains, and we will all find certain things easier and certain things harder. If you're someone that struggles to imagine the scene, don't worry, because it's often writers who have got less of a clear mind's eye. You know, they don't see their imagination as clearly as other people. Sometimes those are the best descriptive writers because they need to be, because they're trying to describe it for themselves so that they can imagine what it looks like. And that's an important note for any of you that do have incredible imaginations and you can see exactly what that house looks like. Remember, your job is to make sure that the reader or the listener sees the same thing you do. So this is what we're trying to do right now, right? If you've already got a very clear vivid imagination of what this house looks like, you need to get that description down onto paper so that the reader can see the same thing. And if you're someone that doesn't really have the full picture yet in your head, we need to start coming to decisions about certain things so that you can imagine it. For example, on the front of the house, is there a door? If there is a door, is it open? Is it closed? Is it broken? Is it bricked up? Is it glass? Is it metal? Tell me about the door. Don't be afraid at any point to pause this video if you want a bit more time to discuss with the other people in the room or just to write down as much detail as you can. Is there a garden at the front of the house? If so, is it grass or is it cobbles? Is it neatly kept and clean, or is it somewhere in between, or is it overgrown and wild with weeds? Write it down, let me know. And what about windows? How many windows can you see on the front of the house? 7? None? I've no idea how big it is. Maybe there's none, maybe there's some. Are they smashed? Are they open? Are they perfectly clean? Can you see anything through them? Are the curtains drawn? Next up, I want you to inject a bit of colour into this story. Imagine the characters looking at the house or at the garden or on the street. Something catches their eye, and that something has a colour. What colour is it? Maybe it's the red brick of the house itself, or maybe it's a green car that's been left abandoned on the side of the road. Maybe it's the beautiful blue sky above, or maybe it's a bit of mud on your character's lilac shoes. Choose something to tell the reader about and describe the colour. Now when I say describe the colour, you can use metaphors and similes and compare the colour to the colour of something else, like the bricks on the old house were dirty and red, almost like rusted metal. Or you can just give me a little bit more detail about that colour. Rather than saying something is blue, tell me it's a deep blue or a rich blue or a faded blue. Just give it a little bit more character so that the reader can imagine it that little bit more clearly. Awesome. Okay, well done. We're getting quite the vision of what's going on now, but that's only one of our senses, right? We've been focusing so far on what the character can see, but what can they feel? What can they hear? It's entirely up to you, but I'd like a little bit of detail about something not that your character can see, but that they experience with one of their other senses. I would usually go with hearing, but it's entirely up to you. What can your character hear? What can they feel? What can they smell in the air? So now you've created quite a descriptive setting for the beginning of the story, right? If you want to, this is a great time to name your character. Don't worry too much about having a completely unique name. You can call them Princess Fart Bubbles, or you can call them Kennedy Ken. I wouldn't recommend either of those names. But that's a good example of how your first or second thoughts aren't always your best. Keep thinking. Perhaps more important than the character's name right now is what happens next. Now, some of you might be way ahead of me on this, right? I know there's a good portion of you screaming at the screen going, they go inside the house, but let's look at our options. Now, the obvious answer for most stories at this point would be for the character to go into the house. But that doesn't need to be what happens. And if they are going to go into the house, we need to think of a reason why. Ask yourself, if you haven't already done this in your story, is have they seen this house before? Have they been down this path, this road before? And if they have been, maybe they've been down that street before, but they've just never seen that house. Again, entirely up to you and whatever kind of story you're trying to write. Some of you, just by answering the questions I've asked already, might have written something that's kind of spooky and scary. Some of you might have written something that's really happy and bouncy and lovely. Some of you might have written something that's really mysterious and weird. But we're still so early on that it's entirely up to you where this story goes. As a little challenge, I want to see how many reasons you can come up with to explain why that character would go into that house. Maybe it's a house that they know. Maybe it's their friend's house and they've been in before. Fine, easy, sorted. But if it's not, then you're going to need to come up with some sort of explanation. So you can write these down or discuss it with a group if you're in a room with other people. But I'll give you a wee minute to come up with as many ideas as you can. Welcome back. I hope you came up with some good explanations. I do want to explore the other options as well, just quickly. If they don't go into the house, there's other things that can happen, right? Maybe the house is just setting the scene for this weird street or this weird journey, or maybe it's something that will come back into the story later on. Maybe the character goes home and then the next day walks down that street again and the house is gone. Or maybe it's moved to the other side, or maybe something significant has changed about it. Maybe they go home that night and go to sleep, and when they wake up, they're inside that house. There is an unlimited amount of options and different ways that this story can go. Again, and it depends a lot on what kind of story you're wanting to tell or what kind of character you're wanting to write. So again, I'm going to give you guys a little minute to discuss it in your groups or write it down if you would rather do it that way, of different ways that this story could go if the character doesn't go into the house. What could happen next if they don't go into the house? Like I said, maybe the house isn't that important to the overall story, or maybe it is and it comes back into it in some way. It's entirely up to you. Okay, well done. That was a lot of stuff I threw at you, a lot of questions, but you went from probably finding it difficult to choose which side of the road the house was on to coming up with all these different ideas for where the story could go. And much like the elephant game that I talked about in the last video, you will all have come up with different ideas, right? Every single one of you. If I was to give you time to go and finish that story, which of course you're welcome to do, by the way, please do go and finish that story if you'd like to, or use that as the basis for a future poem or anything else you want to do. But if you were to go and do that, you would all come up with different solutions, different conclusions, different stories. And that's what's so cool about writing. As I said throughout it, some of you will have found the description a little bit harder than others. Some of you will have found that really easy. Some of you might have found the notion of plot really difficult. Some of you might have found that really easy. Some of you might have really struggled with the logic side of things, right? When we come down to why would the character go into the house? And it's not just about actions like that. Sometimes it's about setting the scene for your story. Describing a scene really well is crucial to letting the reader imagine the same thing as you. But if you want them to feel things, if you want them to feel fear or joy or sadness, you need the character to be relatable too, and that's where that kind of writing comes in. So say for example you had a scary house in your story and you were like, the character runs in because they thought it was cool and then they got murdered. Like, I'm not scared, I don't care about that character. That character is a moron. But if instead you told me that this character had, say, a pet dog that had got startled and ran into the house and the character ran in after their dog, well, now I care. Because it's a fact that animals are better than people. So now we get to focus on the poem that you wrote. And this is really exciting. And it's obviously quite a challenge for me because I'm not there. I haven't read what you've written. But I'm going to try my best to give you some helpful advice and tips so that you can get the most out of your piece. I want you to be proud of what you've written, and that comes down to celebrating the things that you've done well and maybe working a little bit on the things that you feel that you've struggled with. So I gave you a bunch of potential prompts in the last video for different things that you could write your poem about. But as I said then, you can write your poem on whatever you want, so I have no idea what any of you have written about. So let's talk some basic advice. So the first thing we're going to talk about is rhyming. Now, yes, you do not need to rhyme in your poem, and a lot of you probably haven't at all. But I didn't want to neglect the people that had, so we're going to focus on that just quickly at the beginning here. Basically, like everything else I've said, some of you will be really good at rhyming and some of you will not. If you're not good at rhyming, I recommend not writing a poem that rhymes. And if you are good at it, then I recommend pushing yourself to see if you can make the rhymes a bit more complicated. Now, there's a few different ways to do that. So a lot of people, when they're starting to learn how to rhyme, will fall into the same pattern of making one syllable rhyme at the end of every line, and they'll do it all the time, and although it's perfectly fine, it can start to lose its shine. And you don't need to do it that way. You can mix rhymes up at different parts of the line. I'll give you an example. I was born on a mountainside with the pride of a range and the sky on my shoulders. I came from a long line of boulders too strong to be moved. That's a couple of lines from a poem of mine called Happy. And there are rhymes in there, but they don't come at the end of the line. I was born on a mountainside with the pride of a range and the sky on my shoulders. I came from a long line of boulders too strong to be moved. So yeah, you can almost hide your rhymes throughout. It gives you a lot more freedom actually when you're writing it. You might find it's a lot easier than just trying to rhyme at the end every time. And it gives it a little bit more freshness. So I'd encourage you to try and do that at least once in your poem if you are rhyming. And even if your poem doesn't rhyme at the moment, consider trying to put one or two of those in. You don't need to make the rest of it rhyme, but there's nothing against having a couple of bits that do. It just sort of helps with the flow and the melody, and it can just sound nice for when you're performing it. So not only can you put rhymes in different places, but you can also try and rhyme more than one syllable. How do you do? Sorry, I had a mouthful of food. I have a poem called Butterfly, and there's a section in it where it says, this has nothing to do with masculinity, it's just the task you've given me when we're wrapped in infinity. So those are just some examples there, and a lot of them have got multiple syllables, but you can start off with just two. Things like calling and falling, for example. That's still a step up and a good challenge for you if you find that rhyming comes quite naturally to you. It's always good to try and push yourself. One last quick thing on rhyming. There are things known as hard rhymes versus things called soft rhymes. So a hard rhyme would be if you said the man's hands were as cold as ice, you would have to rhyme that with something like lice or mice or spice. The man's hands were as cold as ice. He enjoyed some nice spicy rice with some mice. Yeah, it rhymes, but it's rubbish, isn't it? But you have a lot more options when you consider soft rhymes as well. For example, lights and nights would both rhyme with ice as well, because the sounds that you're rhyming are the I and the S. It doesn't really matter if it has a T in there as well. Or indeed done different letter. The man's hands were as cold as ice. Maybe someone broke the pipes. That was rubbish, but you know what I mean. I had to take a quick call and I forgot that I still had them on. Sorry. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about description. Now, description is a part of writing that I think a lot of people struggle with, but you guys have already done so much of it in this video when we did the house game exercise earlier on. So when you're looking at your poem and looking for ways to make it better, I would recommend just going line by line and asking yourself if you can describe something just a little bit more clearly. For example, don't just tell me you saw a cute dog. Tell me how big their nose was, whether or not one of their ears flopped over. Did they seem like they were smart? Was it the kind of dog you'd laugh at while it chased its own tail for an hour, or the kind of dog that you could sit and have deep conversations with until late at night? It could be both, to be fair. There's a film that some of you might have seen called Dead Poets Society with Robin Williams. It's a great movie, but there's a line in it where he says something along the lines of,
"A man is not very tired, he is exhausted."
And I think that's great advice. So yeah, another thing to maybe check your poem for. Have you used the word very anywhere? And could you instead change that for something else? If any of you are watching this and you haven't yet written a poem, this is why I say to everyone to just write. Write something down. You can edit it later. Get across the main emotion or the main plot or whatever it is that you're writing on. Get across the main points. Even if it's just a big block of marble, we can chisel out the poetry and the beauty from it after that. So do go through every line and ask yourself, could I change this? Could I say this in a slightly different way? And experiment with it. Don't worry about, you don't need to delete something and then put something else in. You can experiment with different ways of saying the same thing until you find one that you're really, really happy with. For example, I said earlier, the man's hands were as cold as ice, right? Think of all the different ways you could say that same thing. The man felt like his fingers were going to fall off. The man regretted not packing his gloves that day. And it'll always be up to you and your style and what you like and how it fits with the rest of the poem. But go through line by line and ask yourself if this is the best way to say what you're trying to say. Another trick you can try and use is to give something in your poem an unusual piece of characterization. That was a weird sentence. What I mean is, instead of just saying there was thunder, you could say the clouds screamed and crashed through the night sky. Or the river looked like it was running away from something. Or my eyebrows looked like they want to hold hands. But you get the idea. You've probably heard someone say something like, oh, my heart weeps. For example, your heart can't cry, but it gets across the message. And although you don't want to overdo it, if you can look through your poem and find a place where something like that might work, then it's worth having a go. Finally, I'd recommend going over your poem with performance in mind. Now, the next video, we're going to look at performance and how to deal with anxiety and all that kind of stuff. So don't worry about that too much right now. But if you are going to read out loud your poem, you want to make sure that it doesn't feel too ugly or clunky or uncomfortable when you're saying it. And you don't even need to practice that out loud. You can just mouth it to yourself. Imagine hearing your voice saying those things. It's a really important step towards feeling confident, saying things out loud in front of people, and it will also help you be a lot more comfortable with your poem in general. Maybe you're trying to memorize it. It will definitely help with that. And yeah, I think it's just a good thing to do in general. So yeah, I hope some of that was useful or helpful to you. I really hope I get the chance to hear some of the work that you guys are writing, and I look forward to our performance video that we do next as well. If you do have any questions, by the way, you can hit me up at my social media handles there, and I will always do my best to get back to people when I can. Thank you very much for listening. Best of luck, and I'll see you in the next video.